Cannibalism was once well-nigh universal among the evolving races. The Sangics were all cannibalistic, but originally the Andinites were not, nor were the Nodites and Adamites. Neither were the Andites until after they had become grossly admixed with the evolutionary races. The taste for human flesh grows. Having been started through hunger, friendship, revenge, or religious ritual, the eating of human flesh goes on to habitual cannibalism. Man-eating has arisen through food scarcity, though this has seldom been the underlying reason. The Eskimos and early Andinites, however, seldom were cannibalistic except in times of famine. The red men, especially in Central America, were cannibals. It was once a general practice for primitive mothers to kill and eat their own children in order to renew the strength lost in childbearing, and in Queensland the first child is still frequently thus killed and devoured. In recent times, cannibalism has been deliberately resorted to by many African tribes as a war measure, a sort of frightfulness with which to terrorize their neighbors. Some cannibalism resulted from the degeneration of once superior stocks, but it was mostly prevalent among the evolutionary races. Man-eating came on at a time when men experienced intense and bitter emotions regarding their enemies. Eating human flesh became part of a solemn ceremony of revenge. It was believed that an enemy's ghost could, in this way, be destroyed or fused with that of the eater. It was once a widespread belief that wizards attained their powers by eating human flesh. Certain groups of man-eaters would consume only members of their own tribes, a pseudo-spiritual inbreeding which was supposed to accentuate tribal solidarity. But they also ate enemies for revenge, with the idea of appropriating their strength. It was considered an honor to the soul of a friend or fellow tribesman if his body were eaten, while it was no more than just punishment to an enemy thus to devour him. The savage mind made no pretensions to being consistent. Among some tribes, aged parents would seek to be eaten by their children. Among others, it was customary to refrain from eating near relations. Their bodies were sold or exchanged for those of strangers. There was considerable commerce in women and children who had been fattened for slaughter. When disease or war failed to control population, the surplus was unceremoniously eaten. Cannibalism has been gradually disappearing because of the following influences. 1. It sometimes became a communal ceremony, the assumption of collective responsibility for inflicting the death penalty upon a fellow tribesman. The blood guilt ceases to be a crime when participated in by all, by society. The last of cannibalism in Asia was this eating of executed criminals. 2. It very early became a religious ritual, but the growth of ghost fear did not always operate to reduce man-eating. 3. Eventually it progressed to the point where only certain parts or organs of the body were eaten, those parts supposed to contain the soul or portions of the spirit. Blood drinking became common, and it was customary to mix the edible parts of the body with medicines. 4. It became limited to men. Women were forbidden to eat human flesh. 5. It was next limited to the chiefs, priests, and shamans. 6. Then it became taboo among the higher tribes. The taboo on man-eating originated in Dalmatia and slowly spread over the world. The Nodites encouraged cremation as a means of combating cannibalism, since it was once a common practice to dig up buried bodies and eat them. 7. Human sacrifice sounded the death knell of cannibalism. Human flesh having become the food of superior men, the chiefs, it was eventually reserved for the still more superior spirits, and thus the offering of human sacrifices effectively put a stop to cannibalism, except among the lowest tribes. When human sacrifice was fully established, man-eating became taboo. Human flesh was food only for the gods. Man could eat only a small ceremonial bit, a sacrament. Finally, animal substitutes came into general use for sacrificial purposes, and even among the more backward tribes, dog-eating greatly reduced man-eating. The dog was the first domesticated animal and was held in high esteem both as such and as food. 6. Evolution of human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was an indirect result of cannibalism as well as its cure. Providing spirit escorts to the spirit world also led to the lessening of man-eating, as it was never the custom to eat these death sacrifices. No race has been entirely free from the practice of human sacrifice in some form and at some time, even though the Andonites, Nodites, and Adamites were the least addicted to cannibalism. Human sacrifice has been virtually universal. It persisted in the religious customs of the Chinese, Hindus, Egyptians, Hebrews, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans, and many other peoples, even on to recent times among the backward African and Australian tribes. The later American Indians had a civilization emerging from cannibalism, and therefore steeped in human sacrifice, especially in Central and South America. The Chaldeans were among the first to abandon the sacrificing of humans for ordinary occasions, substituting therefore animals. About 2,000 years ago, a tender-hearted Japanese emperor introduced clay images to take the place of human sacrifices, but it was less than 1,000 years ago that these sacrifices died out in northern Europe. Among certain backward tribes, human sacrifice is still carried on by volunteers, a sort of religious or ritual suicide. A shaman once ordered the sacrifice of a much-respected old man of a certain tribe. The people revolted. They refused to obey, whereupon the old man had his own son dispatch him. The ancients really believed in this custom. There is no more tragic and pathetic experience on record illustrative of the heart-tearing contentions between ancient and time-honored religious customs and the contrary demands of advancing civilization than the Hebrew narrative of Jephthah and his only daughter. As was common custom, this well-meaning man had made a foolish vow, had bargained with the god of battles, agreeing to pay a certain price for victory over his enemies, and this price was to make a sacrifice of that which first came out of his house to meet him when he returned to his home. Jephthah thought that one of his trusty slaves would thus be on hand to greet him, but it turned out that his daughter and only child came out to welcome him home. And so, even at that late date, and among a supposedly civilized people, this beautiful maiden, after 2 months to mourn her fate, was actually offered as a human sacrifice by her father, and with the approval of his fellow tribesmen. And all this was done in the face of Moses' stringent rulings against the offering of human sacrifice. But men and women were addicted to making foolish and needless vows, and the men of old held all such pledges to be highly sacred. In olden times, when a new building of any importance was started, it was customary to slay a human being as a foundation sacrifice. This provided a ghost spirit to watch over and protect the structure. When the Chinese made ready to cast a bell, custom decreed the sacrifice of at least one maiden for the purpose of improving the tone of the bell. The girl chosen was thrown alive into the molten metal. It was long the practice of many groups to build slaves alive into important walls. In later times, the northern European tribes substituted the walling in of the shadow of a passerby for this custom of entombing living persons in the walls of new buildings. The Chinese buried in a wall those workmen who died while constructing it. A petty king in Palestine, in building the walls of Jericho, laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son, Segub. At that late date, not only did this father put 2 of his sons alive in the foundation holes of the city's gates, but his action is also recorded as being according to the word of the Lord. Moses had forbidden these foundation sacrifices, but the Israelites reverted to them soon after his death. The 20th century ceremony of depositing trinkets and keepsakes in the cornerstone of a new building is reminiscent of the primitive foundation sacrifices. It was long the custom of many peoples to dedicate the first fruits to the spirits, and these observances, now more or less symbolic, are all survivals of the early ceremonies